Like if a drug had a sort of 99% failure rate, like the counting calories strategy, we'd throw it out within 2 seconds, right? We'd say, this drug is garbage, get it out of here. And yet this sort of paradigm sort of lived on for 50 years, not looking at the sort of quality of the diet and, the macronutrients. It's all calories, calories, calories.
I recall giving a lecture in New Jersey several years ago to a very mainstream group of physicians. And I asked the question, what's your go-to treatment for type 2 diabetes? And people raise their hand, sulfonylureas, metformin, insulin, which we'll certainly talk about, and other various drugs. And I said, put your hands down, because please understand, you're not treating diabetes. You're treating the blood sugar, a manifestation of the underlying problem. It's very popular today to treat type 2 diabetes with insulin. And what Dr. Noakes said in your introduction or your foreword to your book, he said it's like treating the alcoholic by giving them alcohol.
It was what I was taught, and everybody was taught that you just give insulin. And you're absolutely right. What we did was we confused the symptom, which was the high blood sugar, for the disease, which is sort of type 2 diabetes, right? So you have type 2 diabetes as a disease which causes high blood sugars. And we treated the symptom with the high blood sugar with insulin, and it got better. But the problem was, and patients knew this, right? This was the stunning part. Patients knew that if I gave them insulin, their sugars got better, but they gained weight. So as they gained weight, they came back to me and said, hey, doc, like you gave me this insulin. I gained like 30 pounds. Like, how is this better?
Yeah.
So they knew that this was actually a vicious cycle, right? So you gain weight, you get to type 2 diabetes, you get insulin to lower the blood sugar, right? Not treat the type 2 diabetes, but lower the blood sugar, which is the symptom. Then you gain weight, which makes your type 2 diabetes worse, which makes me give them more insulin, which makes them gain more weight. And you see how it's going, right? They're spiraling into the drain. And for years, I had no answer to why this was wrong, because I believed that it was the right treatment, as did everybody else, of course, until I realized it's actually the wrong treatment completely. Because, a couple of things struck me. One is that type 2 diabetes is a disease of hyperinsulinemia, right? Insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, they're very much the same thing. And why would you treat a condition of too much insulin with more insulin, right? It makes no sense at all. So if your insulin levels are high, you should actually lower insulin, not make it higher. It's sort of like if you have an abscess or an infection and you get a fever. The fever is caused by the infection, right? The fever is a symptom. So you can treat the fever with acetaminophen. But everybody knows that ain't going to make you better. That's just symptomatic treatment, right? You can lower the fever, but you need antibiotics.
It's not even just avoiding the treatment. You're actually making the situation worse. And who benefits from this? The pharmaceutical
it's
companies
ultimately
are just
the
pumping
pharmaceuticals, yeah.
Many years ago, probably about 15 years ago, the data started coming out about the relationship between type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's. I began looking at those statistics and looking at the statistics that related to risk of developing Alzheimer's based upon your average blood sugar or the A1C. There's not a statement that's not referenced in peer-reviewed science. Several studies how when we cut calories, we are confronted by an equal reduction in our metabolism. A very valuable lesson for people wondering why, gee whiz, I've cut my calories so substantially and I still don't seem to be losing weight. We turn to our doctors because they're educated and they have the answers. They're going to tell us which drug to take, etc. You ask the question in your book, then why are there fat doctors? Type 2 diabetes is a situation in which there's excess insulin because the cells are less receptive. We've become resistant to what insulin is trying to do.
So insulin is a hormone. It's like a key. It goes to the cell surface, like the liver cell, for example, interacts with the cell surface receptor, sort of, which is like a lock. It opens the lock, the gate opens. Now glucose can go into the liver cell and the liver can use that for energy. So in type 1 diabetes, of course, there's no insulin because the pancreas has been destroyed. So therefore, the gate is closed, the glucose in the blood stays high, but inside the cell, there's nothing. There's no energy. So kids, right, untreated, would just keep losing weight until they died. And it didn't matter how much they ate, because that glucose, that energy, those calories couldn't get into where it needed to go, which is the cell. So that's fine. And type 2 diabetes, of course, is a completely different situation. What you have is plenty of insulin, and the insulin that's circulating is normal insulin. It's not defective in any way. So the key is sort of normal. Then you can look at the cell surface receptor, and you can look at the lock, and you can look at it and say it's completely normal as well. So then why is this glucose, why is this gate, not allowing this glucose to go in? And the idea was that, hey, maybe there's like a piece of gum in the lock, right? There's something that's gumming up the lock. The problem is that it didn't fit any of the proper sort of clinical phenotypes. That is, people weren't skinny. They were really, really fat, and they had big fatty livers. So, that's strange, because if your glucose is not getting into your liver cell, why is your liver full of fat, right? It didn't make any sense. It's the complete opposite of type 1 diabetes. What we knew is that there was insulin, but there was also a lot of glucose. So the alternative explanation, because there's always another way that it can happen, is that it's not underfilled, it's overflowing. That is, this liver cell, it's not that there's too little insulin, too little glucose, there's too much. So over time, you have too much glucose, too much insulin. You've shoved all this glucose into the insulin, into the liver cell, and now it's sort of bursting. It's full. And therefore, you can't push any more in. You have to produce more and more insulin to keep shoving more in. So that's the sort of overflow hypothesis of insulin resistance, which is really looking at it as a disease of too much glucose, too much insulin, or the disease is hyperinsulinemia, which makes a lot more sense. It in fact explains everything about type 2 diabetes, because that's why you have obesity associated. That's why you have fatty liver. That's why when you lose weight, you are going to reverse the type 2 diabetes. Now, if you look at these diseases, obesity, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, as diseases of hyperinsulinemia, that sets you up immediately to ask the right question. If my insulin is too high, how am I going to lower insulin? Because that is the root cause, and that is how I am going to be successful. And one of the ways would be to reduce carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are glucose. And carbohydrates stimulate insulin, where proteins and fats do not, for example. And in fact, now you have these studies these days looking at low carbohydrate diets. There's more and more studies in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Some have been extremely successful. I mean, even the American Diabetes Association says low carbohydrate diets have the most scientific evidence behind them for reversal of type 2 diabetes. And then the other way to lower insulin, if the disease is too much insulin, how do you lower insulin? And the other is intermittent fasting, which is sort of a natural solution. If you don't eat, your body will simply burn off the excess glucose, and therefore you're going to be able to reverse your type 2 diabetes. Just this month, actually, 2 randomized control trials looking at intermittent fasting and type 2 diabetes were both extremely positive, almost 50% remission rate of type 2 diabetes. If you think about the millions of Americans who have type 2 diabetes, a 50% remission rate is absolutely stunning. Like, this is a treatment which is free, which is available to anybody, which has been used for thousands and thousands of years. It started with the dietary guidelines for Americans in 1977, I think, where Yudkin and others were sort of like, hey, it's the sugar, whereas Ansel Keys and so on were, hey, it's the fat. So in science, there's always a back and forth, but when you have official pronouncements like the dietary guidelines in 1977, they basically just said, nope, fat is the enemy, and everything had to change to conform to that view, right? And everything else, if you're sort of like Atkins and saying, oh, it's probably the starches and the sugars, that didn't fit the narrative, so you got sort of marginalized, which is unfortunate, because that really stifles scientific debate where legitimate points of view could be brought to mind. As I did my medical training in the 90s, we used these American Heart Association, you may remember this, the step 1 and the step 2 diets, right? So if you had a heart attack, you got a step 1 diet, which was like, I think 10% fat, total fat, which is quite low,
And 2
actually.
grams of sodium.
Yeah. And then if you had another heart attack, which they usually did, then you went to the step 2 diet, which was 7% total fats, which was really like eating cardboard. Turns out when they actually did these sort of studies head to head, they did terribly. These low fat diets did horribly. Remember, there's the Lyon dietary trials, and there's the whole French paradox where, hey, how come the French people are eating all this butter and cheese and they're getting like half the rate of heart attack? That was a huge paradox, right? It turns out dietary fat wasn't really the culprit. So that was where fats got demonized. It was through this sort of just this one pronouncement in 1977 that fat is the enemy. All science must now conform to this, is that as people ate all their sort of white bread and jam for breakfast, what happened is that they didn't replace their, they didn't replace their fat with sort of broccoli. They replaced it with refined carbohydrates. So we know now that if you're eating a whole bunch of sugary cereal or white bread and jam, what happens is your glucose spikes up, your insulin spikes up. By 10:30, it spikes down. You're ravenously hungry, so now you're looking for your low-fat muffin, which did the same thing. It spiked up your glucose, spiked up your insulin. By 12 o'clock, you're ravenously hungry. So now instead of eating 3 times a day, which people were doing in 1977, they were eating 6 times a day, 8 times a day. But they're saying, hey, I'm eating the right food. So therefore, eating frequently must be good. So then this sort of got entrenched that, hey, you should eat 8, 10 times a day, which was the situation I was going into in 2012, 2013, when I was saying that, hey, you should really be eating less often. And people thought I was completely off my rockers, right? How are you going to lose weight while you're eating all the time? When you're eating, your body wants to store those calories. It's only when you don't eat that your body uses those calories, right? When you eat, insulin goes up, your body stores energy, right? You turn off, breaking down you turn off lipolysis, you turn off glycogenolysis, right? So you can't burn fat, you can't burn glycogen. You turn on de novo lipogenesis, so you're actually creating new fat, you're laying down more glycogen. That's normal. That's what you're supposed to do. It's only when you don't eat, insulin goes down and your counter-regulatory hormones go up. Growth hormone, noradrenaline, sympathetic nervous system. That's when you break down fat. That's when you break down glycogen. And the human body knew what to do with energy. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here.
In general, this type of information is so counter to what continues to be parroted in the mainstream that if you just simply cut back on your calories, you're going to lose weight based upon the laws of thermodynamics. And to this day, we have low-fat cookies and the low-fat aisle in the grocery store, and you still see products labeled in hopes that they will sell as being low-fat, despite the fact that they're high in sugar.
It has no calories, it must be fine. It's like, no, it's not necessarily fine, because if you're still stimulating sort of the sweetness, you're still stimulating insulin, you're still stimulating your appetite, for example, then no, taking these artificially sweetened beverages is not going to be the answer. So many of these academic doctors are like, yes, it's calories, calories, calories. So therefore, artificial sweeteners is good because it's 0 calories. It's like, okay, so let me ask you something. How many people have ever said, you know what? I switched to diet soda, lost 20 pounds. Like never, like nobody. Does not happen. It's far more frequent that I say to somebody, get off all that diet soda because they're drinking 10 a day. And they're like, oh, all of a sudden I lost 50 pounds because I'm not stimulating my appetite anymore. So therefore I'm not eating all the time. As I mentioned in the obesity code, it's sort of an easy target, right? Because all of a sudden you're changing the complexity of sort of obesity, which is really a hormonal disease of hyperinsulinemia, um, as well as other things, into something extremely sort of, it's just calories, therefore it's just willpower. And it gets back to the question that I came back at, which was originally well, why are there fat doctors? And everybody thinks that's an insult, but it's not. Most of my friends are doctors, right? These are very smart people, very they don't lack for willpower. When they set their mind to something, they do it. So if you have the knowledge and the willpower to do it, why can't these people lose weight? The only way that happens is that the information that we all believed was not correct. This idea that calories are the sort of be all and end all, and it still pervades through academic circles, right? That's all you hear about is calories, even now. And interestingly, the public has sort of moved past that because they've seen the sort of folly of these calorie reduced diets. So even as those academics are claiming, oh, it's all about calories, it's all about calories, everybody else in the world knows that you can't just count your calories. You can't, and this is where I remember there were doctors that were saying things like, you can eat ice cream for dinner, because if you eat ice cream and it's 1,000 calories and it's the same amount as your steak and salad, it's the same. And I always thought, if you told your grandmother that, she'd say you're completely off your rocker if you think eating ice cream for dinner is the same as eating real food like steak and a salad.
Oh, if I eat the ice cream, I'll just exercise more.
You have two foods. So one food is, say, salmon, for example, or eggs. And another food is cookies. Okay, so you have the same amount of calories. So say 200 calories of eggs versus 200 calories of cookies. The minute you put those foods in your mouth, the hormonal response to those two foods are completely and utterly different. We can measure them. Easy, right? One of them, glucose spikes way up. The other one, it doesn't spike up at all. One of them, insulin spikes way up. The other one, it doesn't spike up at all. So we know that insulin is going to spike with the cookies. If insulin is going to then take those calories, that energy, and put it into storage, because that's its job, right? That's what it's supposed to do. We know that. It stops burning of fat and puts, lays down more fat. So you're going to take those 200 calories, you're going to put it immediately into storage. Well, what's your body going to use for energy? It has nothing. So what's going to happen? Well, your body's going to say, hey, I still need some energy here. Go out and eat some more, right? Whereas with the eggs, your insulin's not going to spike up. You have all that energy, so therefore you're not going to be hungry. And everybody knew this, of course. If you ate eggs for breakfast, you're full until lunchtime. If you ate white bread and jam for breakfast, you're hungry at 10:30. Every person knew this already. The physiology was fully worked out, but it's not about the calories, because the calories are the same. It's about the hormones that are precipitated by eating those foods are different. And you have to pretend that the hormonal difference is completely irrelevant to say that we shouldn't be looking at the types of food that we are eating in addition to the calories. I'm not saying calories is not important, but it's not nearly as important as we think it is. In fact, of course, most ancestral peoples never counted calories. So if you go to a buffet, you can only eat so much. You can't keep eating indefinitely because you're gonna be nauseated or whatever, right? If you've eaten, until you're well overfilled, and then somebody says, hey, why don't you eat this pork chop? You'd be like, I don't think so. It's the hormones that are telling you that, hey, you shouldn't be eating anymore. So those satiety hormones include things like peptide YY, which is in response to protein, cholecystokinin, which is in response to dietary fat. And if you have a lot of bulk in your stomach, you activate stretch receptors in your stomach, which again tell you not to eat. So therefore, those are very powerful stimuli. You can't just override them. The point is that if you eat highly refined carbohydrates like the white bread and jam, there's no protein, there's no fat, and there's no bulk, because you've taken all that bulk out. You've taken all the fiber out. You have no satiety signaling. If you eat steak, you've got protein and you've got fat. So you've got a lot to keep you full. Body fatness is actually very tightly controlled. If you get too fat, your fat cells release leptin. The leptin goes to your hypothalamus, which tells you stop eating. And therefore, it's going to, as you stop eating, your weight is going to go back down, your body fatness is going to go back. So it's a homeostatic sort of relationship. Obesity is not a leptin deficiency state, so therefore you simply cannot just give more leptin. It's a leptin resistant state. That is, your body has leptin, it just isn't signaling it properly. And probably one of the things that is a problem is that if leptin or any hormone, right? Any hormonal system, any body system, if something stays high and stays high for a long time, your body develops resistance to it. So if you have continuously stimulating leptin, then at some point your body just stops resisting. So the only thing you can do is try to sort of lower the leptin by getting the body fat down, and that's a lot of hard work. So the insulin is sort of trying to make you fatter versus the leptin, which is trying to make you leaner. So it's sort of the seesaw balance. So it's very hard to affect it on the leptin side of the seesaw, whereas it's a lot easier to affect it on the insulin side of the seesaw, because the foods you eat and how often you eat are going to play a large role in how much insulin you secrete, whereas you can't do the same thing and say, well, I'm going to eat this and leptin is going to go up or down or whatever. If you eat 100% fructose, for example, then your blood glucose does not go up at all. So people thought, hey, this is really good. But eventually it turned out that people realized that, hey, it was really bad. People who used, say, high fructose corn syrup, which was this artificially fructose enriched substance. Table sugar is sort of 50% glucose and 50% fructose. It turns out that it's in the way that the fructose is metabolized that it's so bad for you. So even you can't see it in the blood glucose, but the fructose cannot be metabolized by any cell in the body other than the liver. So when you eat bread, you get glucose. Every cell in your body can use that glucose. So if you take too much glucose, your brain is going to burn it, your heart is going to burn it, your kidneys are going to burn glucose. If you get a fructose load, none of the other organs can actually burn that fructose. So instead of having like 150, 180 pounds of body burning glucose, all of that fructose goes purely straight into the liver, right? Which is like a 10-pound organ or less. So therefore, the liver then has to decide what to do with it, and it gets metabolized either into glucose, but then your body has glucose, so it doesn't turn it into glucose, it turns it into fat. It stimulates de novo lipogenesis, which gives you fatty liver, which then worsens this whole cycle of insulin resistance. So the key organ in metabolism, and a lot of metabolism, is the liver, and it's going sort of straight to the liver. It's like a guided missile that goes straight to the liver and causes a lot of havoc right at the liver.